remember perfectly. So we are going to start at 3. We'll get some green light from Lucia in the some sound, which is not too good.
You are now muted.
This is you, Catherine, I guess, no? So if you could have a better sound.
Microphone open. I just shut it after you said I will shut it again now.
Okay, but it was okay. And so we give the word to Catherine. Then I present this slide. I can show you what they look like. So there is first the poster with the webinar series well separated from the SCGES logo this time. Whoa. And then we have this similar slides to the other time. So we had 297 people registered this morning, but now it's more than 313 already, but the slides were prepared a few. Were prepared this morning. And it's interesting because there are much less people from Europe compared to the other one. We could make comparisons, but there are quite a lot of people in Africa, which makes sense, of course. I think it's due to the local influence of Roseanne, probably. And also, it's also interesting that the proportion of female is even much bigger than the one which was on the gender gap in mathematics. In gender gap in mathematics, it was maybe around 15% non-female, but this time it's even smaller. And so by discipline, so well, then many people don't give their discipline, and then there is a group of which is mixed up with 1 or 2 people, like one person in history of science, for example, Catherine, I can tell you, which is you. And then when we look at the distribution of people, we see that it's just at the same time very, very diverse, with people also from administration, journalists. So it means really there is a wide interest in gender equality in science. Okay, so that's what I am going to say after Catherine's talk. And then we give the word to Alice, and it will be then at the moment where I'm going to switch from this slide to the slides of Roseanne, and I can show you just to check that it's working.
Sorry, just to confirm, when I finish talking, I give over to you and not to Alice then, okay?
Yes, yes. Okay. To me, to just present the slides quickly. And I wanted to...
Okay, is either of you able to add after her name? In your case, Marie-Françoise, I think. If you can add between brackets,
no,
I am...
In my case, I don't want to do it because it's not asking to me normally, and I'm also connecting under various
okay,
you know, organizations, so I just keep my name if it's okay for you. Okay, so you see, Roseanne, you see your slides? Roseanne, do you see them?
Muted, yes, I do.
Yes, okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so you just have to tell me, you know, next, or if you ask me to come back and so on, and I try to do what you ask me. If I don't, you just ask me again. Okay, hi, Vivi.
Hi.
Okay, so I go back to the other ones then. So it takes some time to switch, but Not too much, in fact.
Sorry, just to confirm, when I finish talking, Vivi, if I may say, I don't know if you can adjust, but at the moment, the top of your head is not visible. Either that's
Yeah,
it.
thank you. Okay, I see that also Alice is with you. Oh, very nice.
Joining in, we've had to change rooms. Here she is.
Okay. Hi.
I have to get my notes. I forgot. Just 2 seconds.
Hi, Alice.
Okay, so I'm hearing everybody well. So we are ready. The only person that needs to connect at some point is Colette. But maybe she needs to be connected at the end, just when we have the chat discussion. And I know she had a meeting before, so probably she is not there yet, but there is no impact on the beginning of the session. So if you ask me to come back and so on, then I'll try to do what you ask me. If I don't, so Catherine, you will be the one saying welcome to the webinar and so on.
Yes.
You will go first.
How do I know when to start?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to remove my, or maybe okay. Who should be with the camera on when we start? So it takes some time to switch, but Catherine, maybe we put Catherine, myself, and Alice on the screen when we start, and Roseanne and Vivi will put your camera on later. I think maybe it's better.
And I will switch off once I have finished.
Yes, and Vivi too. Okay. I think that's okay to have the three of us at the beginning.
Please, now everybody is quiet until 3 p.m., okay? You communicate over the chat.
So, wait, Alice, disappear? Right. Oh, Alice is no more there at all. Oui.
Lucia vient nous demander de nous taire et de communiquer dans le chat.
Let me go and check.
But no speaking at the beginning. But you speak at the beginning. So, Catherine, you will be the one saying welcome to the webinar and so on.
Yes. How do I know when to start?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to remove my. Or maybe okay. Who should be with the camera on when we start? Catherine. Maybe we put Catherine, myself, and Alice on the screen when we start, and Roseanne and Vivi will put your camera on later. I think maybe it's better.
And I will switch off once I have finished.
Yes, and Vivi too. I think that's okay.
There. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's okay, you think?
Oh, Alice is no more there at all.
Lucia vient nous demander de nous
Costa,
taire.
what do you think? Am I okay? Can you see me well?
We have been asked completely silent for the last 5 minutes. You should switch the microphone off and communicate.
We should be silent now, Alice. Okay. Good.
Hello, and welcome to the second SCGES webinar. My name is Catherine Jamy. I am a researcher at the French CFRS, and I am the chair of the Standing Committee for Gender Equality in Science, which is organizing these webinars. So SCGES is an independent committee formed in 2020 by 9 international scientific organizations, most of which are full members of the International Science Council, ISC. These founding partners had worked together on the ISC-supported project called A Global Approach to the Gender Gap in Mathematical, Computing and Natural Sciences, how to measure it, how to reduce it. This project became known as the Gender Gap in Science Project. Today, SCGES has 19 partners, most of which are ISC International Union members. They represent millions of scientists brought together across disciplines to promote gender equality in science. The aim of SCGES is to ensure liaison amongst international scientific unions to foster gender equality and the implementation of recommendations of the Gender Gap in Science project, especially in the scientific communities that the scientific unions represent. SCGES has also issued recommendations to safeguard gender equality in science in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. SCGES actively cooperates with policymakers and international organizations, first and foremost ISC, for the promotion of gender equality in science. Therefore, it is quite fitting that for the second SCGES webinar, GenderInSITE, one of our members, has teamed up with the International Science Council to present the results of a global survey on women in global science organizations. GenderInSITE and ISC have conducted this survey jointly with the International Academy Partnership. So before handing over the chair to Alice Abreu, I would like to give the floor to Marie-Françoise Roy, who will give us a few statistics of how many we are and who we are. Marie-Françoise, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine, and welcome everybody to this second session of the SCGES webinar. The first session was devoted to gender equality in mathematics and was jointly organized by the IMU and ICIAM. And this time, as Catherine said, it's jointly organized by GenderInSITE and the International Science Council. So, in fact, we have some statistics about how many people are registered. So this morning it was a little under 300, but already now we are more around 315. And this is the geographic balance in the world. So you can see particularly strong participation of scientists in Africa. And when you register, also we ask you some information about who you are. And so we know that many of you are in fact women, female scientists, and there are very few who are not, either because they declare they are male, or maybe they are, but they say that they prefer not to give the answer, or they didn't give the answer. If we look at the distribution by discipline, today it's very, I would say, well balanced, with several scientific communities well represented in mathematics, biology, health, chemistry, environment, physics, social sciences, engineering, earth sciences, and also various group of people in neurosciences, in agriculture, in computer science, in gender studies also, and then we group together people who are kind of very few in their own discipline, and then also a proportion of people didn't give their discipline. And when we look at the state of the studies or career of people who are registered, we see that it's really extremely diverse, because it really goes from undergraduate students, PhD students, postdocs, and all the levels of the academic career, including Emerita professors such as myself. And also we see that there are people working in the administration, which are head of department, journalists, and so on and so on. So it's encouraging for us, because it means that the interest for gender equality in science is really a topic of interest for many, many people. And with this, I would like to wish you a very nice session. And I think, so Catherine, you are speaking again, or we give the word directly to Alice? Okay, so then Alice, please talk.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good night to everyone that joins all over the world. I am Alice Abreu, Emeritus Professor of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And I would like, first of all, to thank very much the Standing Committee for Gender Equity in Science for inviting me to moderate this webinar, and especially to organize this series of webinars, which I think will really bring to the table some very interesting issues related to gender and science. This webinar in particular, which is that looks at the participation of women in global science organizations, brings to the table a very important discussion on the role of such organizations and their relevance to science development. These international non-governmental associations, like the three organizations that organized the report, the InterAcademy Partnership, the International Science Council, and GenderInSITE, are all organizations that bring to the table the voice of the scientist itself. themselves. And I think they bring together several types of organization, either academies of science or scientific unions by disciplines, or even regional networks. And what they do is they have a very important role in conceptualizing key issues in the scientific world. They have an influence upwards in the sense that they are heard and really involved in the discussions of huge multilateral organizations like the UN, UNESCO, and so on, bringing the perspective of science to their discussions. But they're also very important downwards in the sense that their discussions more or less equate the problems for the scientists in general and for the national and regional organizations. So it is really important to understand what are their actions and what do they think about the participation of women and gender equity in science. And I think to present this report, we have two wonderful scientists that have been working in this for many years. Roseanne Diab, who is the director of GenderInSITE and an emeritus professor of the KwaZulu-Natal in Durban in South Africa, and was for many years the executive office of the Academy of Science of South Africa, and Vivi Stavrou, the senior science officer at the International Science Council, and who is the executive secretary of the ISC Committee for Freedom and Responsibility of Science. I will ask them both to give more details about themselves and the institutions they represent, and who are involved in the survey when they talk. So without much ado, I'm giving Roseanne the floor. Roseanne, the floor is yours. Please introduce yourself and the institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you, Alice, and to Marie-Françoise and Catherine for those introductions. So I'm joining you this afternoon from Durban in South Africa. So it's the late afternoon for me, and it's a great pleasure to present this webinar together with my colleague Vivi from the International Science Council. And I thank Alice for those introductory words. I am, by discipline, I'm an environmental scientist, specifically in atmospheric science, but I stopped being active in research at the university when I joined the Academy of Science of South Africa as executive officer, where I was for 10 years. I then retired at the end of 2018, and since then I have been leading GenderInSITE. I actually succeeded Alice in that position. So let me go to the next slide. If we may, Marie-Françoise is going to control the slides, and I'll say a little bit about GenderInSITE. So the origin of GenderInSITE was the Gender Advisory Board of the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development. It was conceptualized in 2010, and so it's quite a long time ago, and the main purpose was to incorporate gender considerations into policy frameworks that support STI, science, technology, and innovation, research, and education that are addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason was that it was thought that science, innovation, technology, and engineering for development policy and programs would be more effective, they would be more equitable and more sustainable with the application of a gender lens. So GenderInSITE has been supported through two Swedish CEDA grants, the first from 2012 to 2017, and the second from May 2017 to December 2020. We have been hosted by the World Academy of Sciences, commonly known as TWAS, based in Trieste. We have 2 regional offices, one in Africa, hosted by the Academy of Science of South Africa in Pretoria, and a second one in Buenos Aires, which is our Latin American focal point. We're currently in the process of exploring new hosting arrangements or the establishment of a not-for-profit organization. May I have the next slide, please? So this just captures what the GenderInSITE, I sometimes refer to it as GIS, niche is. GIS is positioned at the nexus of gender, site, and development. And so you can see that there are relationships which are well known between gender and site, between gender and development, between site and development. But what we do is we bring them all together and we positioned at the nexus of all 3. And our main goal is to increase the number of site policies and programs on a global basis and a regional basis, which take account of the gender dimension of site. We promote the full participation of both men and women in site, and we would like to focus on a consideration of differential impacts of development on men and women. They experience development differently, and we would like to focus on that. And the main purpose, as I've said before, is to enable equitable and sustainable development. Next slide, please. These are some of the reports that we have published over the years. They're all available, open access, can be downloaded on our website, which is genderinsight.net. One that was published in 2018 was the Pathways to Success report. It was bringing a gender lens to scientific leadership of global challenges. That was something that Alice was very involved in. It's been translated into Spanish. We've also produced a follow-up policy brief on the same topic, women's leadership in the global science system. A very recent report has been the gender dimension of digital technologies. And then we've done quite a bit of work on gender and innovation, which has been a fairly neglected area, looking at the implications for sustainable development. So we held a very successful workshop in 2018, actually 2017 in South Africa, and the proceedings report is there on the top right. We followed that up with a gendered innovation policy brief, and then just an indication that we've also produced a number of fact sheets where one applies the gender lens to science-based development, and these have been translated into various languages. That one there is been translated into Arabic. Next slide, please.
So your next steps, get your presentation together.
All right, so let's get down to the business of today, which is to look at the report that was published in collaboration between GenderInSITE, the InterAcademy Partnership, which is also based in Trieste in Italy, and the International Science Council. The report was titled Gender Equality in Science, Inclusion and Participation of Women in Global Science Organizations. What this does is it reports on the results of surveys which were conducted among science academies, and these could be members of either the IAP or the ISC. In some cases, they're members of both. In addition to surveying the science academies, we also surveyed the ISC international disciplinary unions and associations, always to look at the inclusion and participation of women scientists. Importantly, this study was a follow-up to a first global survey of science academies that was conducted in 2015. That one only looked at science academies, not the ISC unions and associations. And that was conducted by the Academy of Science of South Africa in partnership with the Network of African Academies of Science. So the purpose of this report or the study is to look at the inclusion and participation of women scientists in these global organizations and the extent to which progress in gender equality has been made by science academies, because we now have data from both the 2015 study and the 2020 study. Next slide, please. Importantly, this new study had a broadened focus. It now included medical academies as well as national young academies, which weren't included in the first study in 2015, as well as the ISC member academies, which are mainly drawn from the social sciences. The ISC academies weren't included in the first study in 2015. And on top of all those academies, we included the international disciplinary unions and associations of the ISC. There were slightly different questionnaires that were circulated to both sets of, both groups, but there was a lot of overlap. We received 85 submissions from academies, which gave us a 44% response rate, and we received 38 from the disciplinary unions and associations, which gave us a 64% response rate. Next slide, please. So the methodology is summarized here. We had two separate surveys, one for the academies and one for the ISC organizations. It was an online survey. The academies, as I've mentioned before, could be members of either the IAP or ISC, or they could be both, members of both. The survey of the disciplinary unions and associations we refer to in the report as ISC organizations. So that covers both the unions and the associations. The Academy survey was administered between November 2019 and March 2020, and the ISC organizations between May and June 2020. So this, I think the next part is a little bit of an overlap. The membership overlaps. I mentioned we included medical academies, and the population was 215, and the submissions we received was 146. If we removed the duplicates, because we did receive some of those, we had valid submissions of 85 for academies. In the case of ISC, we had 38. Next slide, please. So I'm going to run through some of the findings or some of the results, and then we'll bring together the results of both the academies and the results of the ISC organizations, and then we'll close off with some recommendations. But let's just look first of all at the survey of academies. Probably, as most of you know, most countries have a national science academy. They're very prestigious organizations, and members are elected to membership of a science academy by their peers based on their reputation and their scientific profile. The average women's membership across all the science academies that were monitored is 20%. This is an increase from the base of 13%, which we found in 2015, for a slightly lower number of academies, only 47 instead of the 85. Interestingly, the academy that had the highest number of women members was the Academy of Sciences of Cuba, and that came out at 33%, still way below the 50% parity, but it was also the highest in 2015, and it had increased from 27% to 33%. All the science academies that were monitored showed an increase in women's membership, but I think one of the disturbing findings is that there are 19 academies that are still reporting 10% or less women's membership. An interesting finding was that the academies of young scientists have the largest share of women members. The one that was highest ranked was the South African Young Academy of Science, came out at 57%, so more women than they have men. And this was followed by the Young Academy of Finland at 55%, and the National Academy of Young Scientists of Pakistan also at 55%. And note the last bullet is that 10 young academies are ranked ahead of the Cuban Academy, which was the highest ranked senior academy. Next slide. So I think it's important when we're looking at academy membership to remember that one can only be elected to membership of the academy if one has conducted and has quite a high research profile. So we needed to look at what was the percentage of women researchers from which the academies could draw in each of these countries. So this was a survey that was undertaken by UNESCO some years ago, and we looked at the percentage share of women researchers for 126 countries. And the range is very interesting. The lowest was Chad at 3.4% and 75.6% in Myanmar, and only 13 countries, in other words, 10% of the countries, is the share of women researchers greater than 50%. So we speak about a gender gap, which is the gender gap between the share of women researchers in a country and the women academy members. All right, and that's generally quite large. For example, let's look at some of them where it was quite large. The Macedonian Academy of Science and Arts, 10% members of an academy versus 53.4% women researchers. Lithuanian Academy of Sciences, 7% academy members are women, but 49.5% of the researchers are women. And similarly, a big gap in the Mongolian Academy. In some, the gender gap is quite low, and I draw attention to the Ethiopian Academy of Sciences. They have a very low percentage of women membership in academies, but look at the share of women researchers, it's also very low. So one can't expect the share of academy members to grow if the share of women researchers doesn't grow simultaneously. Let's go to the next one. The membership breakdown is I think, as expected, as we all know, but just to confirm what we found, there are two disciplines where the membership is highest, and they stand out. That's the biological sciences, 28% women members, social sciences, humanities and arts, 27%. And as always, sorry, Marie-Françoise, but the mathematical sciences is way down there and needs to do something. 8% women members in mathematical sciences, computer sciences, ICT, 9%, and the others ranging in between. Next slide, please. We looked at the academies in terms of leadership to see whether women were assuming leadership positions. 73 academies have got a president or a chair. They go by different names. And just over 1/5 of those have got a woman in that position. 6 academies have a structure where they have co-chairs. All of them have at least one woman as a co-chair, and 5 reported having 2 women. We then looked at the average share of women on the governing body, which is normally a board or a council. And these again are people who are elected to, or in some cases, I think they're appointed to govern the academies. And women have a share of 29% on the governing body, and that has increased from 21% in 2015. One of the really good results to come out of this was that the National Academy of Sciences in the US has got 67%. So they've made a really great effort to get more women into their governing body. Similarly, the Venezuelan Academy, 67%, and then the Global Young Academy, which is based in Germany, has 64%. So it's not quite certain why some academies have increased like this. It might be indicative of a concerted effort to involve more women in their governing body, but they can only elect women who are actually academy members. Next slide, please. Then we did an investigation of the policies, gender policies in the academies, as well as gender-related activities that they're undertaking. And what we found is that 36%, so over a third, have got a document of some sort, a strategy, a policy, or a founding document that explicitly mentions the need for increased participation of women in the Academy's activities. 1/4 present a Women in Science Award, and again, 1/4 have published a report that is related to women or gender. A major concern that we found was that only 6 academies responded that should be 2015 report. And remember, the 2015 report contained many recommendations for academies, but only 6 reported that they had discussed that report at a strategic planning meeting of the academy. Exceptionally disappointing. Next slide, please. Right, so our survey also probed diversity and inclusivity. This wasn't something that we had done in the first survey, but we really wanted to interrogate to what extent academies are embracing these concepts of diversity and inclusivity. And so we're thinking here not just of gender, but more broadly, perhaps ethnicity, perhaps race, perhaps age, concepts like that. We found that 30 academies, remember we had a baseline of 85 responses, 30 academies had a committee that focused on women and gender issues. Only 7 mentioned that they had a broader focus and that they included issues of diversity and inclusivity as part of the function and responsibility of a committee. And the ones that did that are listed here below. The Royal Society of Canada, the National Academy of Medicine in the US, the Australian Academy, Austrian Academy, the Young Academy of Belgium, Royal Irish Academy, and the Royal Society in the UK. Next slide, please. For the first time, we also probed sexual harassment policies because there's been so much literature about sexual harassment subsequent to our 2015 report. We found that 22% have a document that addresses sexual harassment in the workplace. In most cases, we found that where there was a standalone document, it had been a very recent development. What is more common is for sexual harassment to be addressed as part of a human resources policy or a workplace policy under conditions of service or a code of conduct. Some academies reported that they have a structure that deals with issues of sexual harassment. So for example, the Indian National Science Academy has a committee. The Junge Akademie in Germany has an equal opportunities officer, and the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, an external confidential counselor. So you can see that they're beginning to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace, and they deal with it in slightly different ways. Next slide. When we looked at their activities, we have here a summary of what the academies are actually doing. So these are sort of gender perspectives. And you can see at the bottom is a scale that shows percentage. And we can see that relatively few align their activities with SDG 5, which is the gender equality SDG. Next, we have around, I'm just trying to go down the scale there, it's around about 50% have a focus on girls in STEM education. This is something that's particularly popular in academies in developing countries. Slightly more, going up to just under 70%, consider gender implications when they undertake their science advisory activities. So science academies have a purpose, and that is to advise governments give advice to governments. And there are just below 70% that are considering the gender implications of this. Slightly less have got a drive to increase the number of women in their nomination pool for prizes and awards. Slightly less has got a drive to increase women in their membership nomination pool. But more have a drive to include women in panels and committees. So they seem to be committed to including women in panels and committees, but not so much membership. And the highest, over 80%, are promoting women to more decision-making levels, which is good. Next slide, please. Right, so I think that brings me to the end of the survey on science academies. We're going to deviate very slightly from the program that was advertised, and Vivi is going to come in now and report on the results of unions and associations, and then I'll come back again at the end to talk about the recommendations. Thanks very much. Over to you, Vivi.
Thank you, Roseanne. Hello to everybody who's there. I'm very pleased to join you. My name is Vivi Stavrou, as said, Executive Secretary of the Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science and Science Officer at the ISC. Could we go to the next slide? And just to say that I'm aware that the questions are coming through in the chat box, and we will, Roseanne and I and Alice will look at them, respond to the questions at the end of the presentation. Let me take a minute to talk about the International Science Council. We are a global membership-based organization, and we include both the natural and the social sciences. We are funded by our members, some grants. We headquartered in Paris. In fact, I'm joining you from Paris this afternoon, my time. Could we go to the next slide? Now, we at the moment have got about 220 members at the ISC, and our vision is very much to advance science as a global public good. And let me just expand on that to a second and relate it to the survey. Now, talking about science as a global public good is a vision with profound implications of the way we understand science and the ways in which science is conducted, how it's used, and the roles it plays in society. Broadly defined, the sciences have played vitally important roles in human history. And as Alice pointed out, as such, scientific institutions, organizations, academies, scientists themselves are key members of society. Now, science as a public good thrives and benefits when it is shared, and science belongs to everybody. So an important goal of scientific institutions, of scientists, is not only to discover and interrogate new knowledge, but very much also to share and explain what is known for the benefit of all. If we can go to the next slide. Now, the ISC's work is very much underpinned by the principle of freedom and responsibility in science. And this principle sets out the freedoms that scientists should enjoy, the 4 freedoms of movement, association, expression, and communication, and the responsibilities that they carry as practicing researchers, as scientists. And we view women's participation in science, gender issues more broadly in science, as a fundamental issue for the free and responsible practice of science. If we can go to the next slide, please. So and all of that, of course, is underpinned by what we can say the right to science, the right to share in and to benefit from advances in science and technology is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as is the right to engage in scientific inquiry, pursue and communicate knowledge, and to associate freely in such activities. And then the next slide describes my committee. So CFRS is an advisory body for the ISC, and it's a committee of experts. It's quite independent from around the world. The experts, CFRS advises the council on CFRS cases. We deal with cases. In fact, we've got 44 active cases at the moment that come from our members concerning threats to the free and responsible practice of science. And it deals with individual scientists as well as more generic cases, for example, threats to the institutional autonomy of scientific institutions, as well as a broad range of projects. And one of our projects is the Gender Equality in Science project that we've been speaking about, that Catherine and Alice introduced. The next slide, please. And now I'm going to look at the results of the survey, but focusing on the unions and associations, the ISC unions and associations, of which 38 took part. Now, if I can broaden out a little bit, from a right to science lens, if we can use that phrase, barriers to access science, to access scientific education, or to participate in scientific activity, and barriers to benefit from the knowledge and products of science come in many forms. These barriers can be experienced by women scientists as hostile workplace environments. Roseanne has mentioned sexual harassment. In fact, the gender gap study that was mentioned earlier, looking at mathematical computing and natural sciences, shows that women's experiences in both educational and employment settings are consistently less positive than men's, and more than a quarter of women's responses across the sciences reported experiencing sexual harassment at the university or at work. Barriers, however, can also be seen in the disciplinary unions with the statistics you find in front of you. In terms of the lack of adequate resources, systematic policies, and strategies explicitly mentioning the need for the increased participation of women in the activities of the disciplinary unions and associations. And these policies may range from strategic plans and mission statements to guidelines for support at scientific conferences and meetings. For example, at the time of the research, less than half, 42% of the disciplinary organizations with the secretariat had a policy for addressing sexual harassment in the workplace. 32% of the disciplinary organizations indicated that they have grants, sorry, my computers were wobbling a bit, that they have grants, fellowships, or awards specifically for women. 53% reported a committee or research board or similar structure with a specific focus on women in science issues. And 59% reported an initiative, an advocacy or networking activity aimed at the promotion of gender equality in science. And almost 2/3 of the ISC disciplinary unions and associations reported that they've published findings that specifically address issues related to women or gender. but only about a third have a strategy to increase women's participation in their activities. So we see a slight disjuncture in terms of that. If we can go to the next slide. When we look at governing bodies, the study reports that women's elected membership in senior governance positions has increased from 2015. There's definitely been progress. However, women are still underrepresented. International unions and associations have an average of 36% of women serving on their governing bodies. And this share equals or exceeds 50% for 10 of the 38 disciplinary organizations surveyed. In terms of comparisons, social science organizations are ranked higher in terms of the share of women on the governing body, substantially higher, 67% versus 24% for the physical and natural science organizations. And then if we compare with the academies that Roseanne was talking about, the average share of women serving on governing bodies was 29% for academies and 37% for international disciplinary organizations. So the 37% of the organizations currently have a woman president, and this is up from 32% in 2015. And 39% currently have a woman occupying the position of executive director. And this is an increase from 16% in 2015. Now, regarding another question that was posed was how many women attend the General Assemblies, which are important decision-making fora for the disciplinary associations. Now, 58% of disciplinary organizations reported that they did not collect gender, sex disaggregated data for their participants. And where such data was available, only in the case of 11% of disciplinary organizations did over 50% of women attend the General Assemblies. And in fact, talking about indicators, talking about measures of change, only one disciplinary organization said that it had been evaluated on its performance and action in terms of women's participation in gender equality in science. So just over half of the disciplinary organizations claim that they regularly monitor women's participation amongst their membership. So there are very clear gaps in systematically mainstreaming such assessment and evaluation measures. So we see high-level statements with regards to gender equality, but a relative paucity of concrete policies to guide what gender equity means in practice, to identify and recommend a variety of tools, again, to operationalize, to reduce the global gender gap. Next slide, please. The disciplinary organization's commitment to diversity and inclusivity issues is at 68% agreement. But actions and activities are trailing far behind at 32% agreement or below. And only a quarter of those have an actual structure that addresses diversity and inclusivity. So the more we dig down in terms of the structural underpinnings, the less it gets. With only 16% reporting having a budget to implement activities related to gender equality. Now, a fundamental shift in framing our understanding and action in tackling gender inequity is intersectionality, broadening the lens of gender equality policies and actions in research to intersections with other forms of discrimination, and Roseanne mentioned, such as ethnic origin, religion, citizenship, language, in some instances, political and other opinion, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. The principle of intersectionality gives us alternative ways of looking at gender, and also importantly of taking in multiple worldviews. And I really believe that the growth of transdisciplinary research in this respect is an important approach in terms of developing a gender inclusive research culture. So let's go to the next slide. And here we can see in terms of the activities, that the organizations are looking at, there's an increased number, you know, at just around 50%, an increased number of women in the nomination pool for prizes and awards. The focus on SDG 5, yeah, it's around 50%. And I would imagine that if we take another survey, this, well, hopefully will have risen. Much more effort put into including more women at decision-making levels, in committees and activities, and a lot of work in promoting participation of women at events. Thank you. I'll hand over to Roseanne to take us through the recommendations.
Roseanne, before you start, let me perhaps say how important these both of your talks show. Something that one sees very clearly, and that I think that your recommendations will be key. In these more than 30 years of, you know, looking at gender in science, we realized that the problem is a systemic one. And only if you have systemic actions, you can really face the problem with efficiency. And I think it's very interesting how both of you showed how the issue of gender in science has increased enormously in terms of being discussed, but how difficult it is to implement some really structural changing actions to face it. So Roseanne, you now have the floor to think a little bit about this and show us what the report says about that.
Thank you, Alice. And yes, I would agree with you. There has been a shift in terms of the numbers. It's looking positive. The percentage of women who are participating in various ways has increased in both the ISC organizations and in science academies, but it is ever so slow. It's painfully slow. So let me just, before I get onto the recommendations, just reiterate that this was a collaborative study that was undertaken by, it was led by GenderInSITE, which is not an organization, we're an initiative. But we collaborated with two key organizations. The first one is the InterAcademy Partnership, which is the family of academies, the family of science academies. And it represents a global network, and the academies belong to that, to the InterAcademy Partnership, the IAP. The ISC, similarly, is a very, very influential global organization that has as members both academies and these disciplinary unions and other associations. So we work together to really think very carefully about what recommendations we were going to make, and which we hoped to disseminate very widely. Because as you have heard from both of us, There was a strong focus on numbers, but we really wanted to move beyond that. So our overarching recommendation is that the report is calling for a coalition for gender equality in global science. I think that's the recommendation that's underpinning everything. Here we had a collaboration between two very forceful change makers and leaders, the IAP and the ISC. And this is the beginning of a global coalition for gender equality in science. The report calls for ongoing collaboration amongst the three of us, and we believe that these survey results provide very important baseline information for what we would hope would be a transformative action agenda for gender equality in global science. We cannot just sit back and let this change at the snail's pace it has been. We have to work together to get a transformative action agenda. The organizations that we surveyed, they represent a very large proportion of global scientific endeavor. In fact, together, the IAP and the ISC represent over 250 unique global organizations or platforms or associations. That's a very large number. So this is what we hope is just the beginning of a global coalition. May I have the next slide, please? All right, so we had 10 recommendations in all. I'm not going to run through each of them. I have selected some to discuss in detail, but they're all available in the report, which is available online on both the ISC, IAP, and GenderInSITE's website. So the first recommendation was related to the extension of the survey. We believe that it would be very, very critical to supplement the results of this study with results from other global science organizations so that we can build and strengthen this nascent coalition for gender equality in global science. And some of the global organizations that we really think should be included in surveys, in follow-up surveys, first of all, the Global Research Council, which represents many, many organizations across the globe. Now, it's possible that it may not be necessary to survey them from scratch because the GRC has undertaken a number of surveys already, but the results of those surveys need to be integrated with the ones that we've got. A key organization is the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, the WFEO, and another very key one is CATES, the International Council of Academies of Engineering and Technological Sciences. So just as we have the IAP, which is the network of science academies, there's another network, which is a network of academies of engineering and technological sciences. And I think they need to be surveyed as a very, very urgent follow-up. So the actions to consider is the extension of the survey, perhaps a slight modification to other relevant organizations. Thanks, Marie-Francoise. We can move over. I'm going next on to the third recommendation, which was about the development of a central repository. We collected, as part of the survey, a host of information about policies, strategies, interventions from various science academies. There needs to be some place, a repository where these policies are placed. So we have a record of them. Most of them are gender-related policies and actions. And if we can establish a central repository, then we could establish much closer links between the organizations. And I think the most important aspect here is that it presents an opportunity to learn from each other's best practices. There's some organizations that have really done a lot of work to incorporate gender, and I think that we could learn a lot from them. In the case of academies, I think the shining lights here are the Australian Academy of Science, which is really leading the way in terms of what they're doing. Another excellent example is the UK Academy of Medical Sciences. And I think with unions, perhaps Vivi could suggest that there are also some very good exemplars there as well. So actions to consider, there need to be discussions between the ISC and the IAP about who is going to host the central repository, how are we going to fund it, and how are we going to maintain it. Thank you, Marie-Francois. The fourth recommendation was about the incorporation of regional considerations. Although I haven't mentioned, neither of us has mentioned this in our presentations, the report did go into quite some depth about the important regional variations that we found, for whatever reason, be it geography, be it cultural, be it history, but there are some very important regional variations. And I think what is interesting is that each of us, each of our organizations, the IAP, the ISC, and GenderInSITE have regional footprints. And these regional footprints present an opportunity to learn more from the regions and to coordinate actions to advance our gender transformative agenda, especially in the countries and regions that are lagging. If I think, for example, of GenderInSITE, we have got offices in Africa, in Southern Africa, that covers the whole of Africa, and another one in Latin America. And many of the organizations, ISC and IAP, have networks that are based in regions, and they can provide an opportunity to convene. So the actions that we really need to consider are firstly to provide an opportunity for these regional networks to convene under the banner of gender equality in science, to identify best practices and to engage in shared learnings. And one way, if we cannot get the funding to do this as a separate initiative, but one way to do this might be at the General Assemblies of the ISC and the IAP, is actually to get gender committees together at these General Assemblies to discuss best practices and share their learnings, and in this way, disseminate best practices. We believe it's important to commission a report on best gender equality practices for academies and unions, and I'm sure there would be many people who would like to contribute to that. I've already mentioned about the opportunity to convene at the General Assemblies. And then we think there should be a platform, a social media platform, a website, where we can disseminate news about academies and unions that have embraced gender transformation. There's no one place where all of this information is disseminated at the moment, and we need to consider creating such a platform. Next slide, please. Recommendation 6 pertains to diversity and inclusivity. Most of you will probably know that the trend these days is to be all-inclusive and to incorporate gender with other issues of diversity and to be fully inclusive. Our recommendation was a little bit more cautious. We concluded that at the moment it's best to follow a stepwise approach to retain the focus on gender equality, because we haven't yet achieved what we want to achieve in gender equality. So we thought it would be best to retain the focus on gender equality, but simultaneously raise awareness about the need for transformative action that goes beyond just gender, that embraces other aspects, the ones that Vivi spoke about that are part of this whole intersectionality agenda. We believe that one way to raise awareness is that the 3 organizations, GenderInSITE, the IAP, and the ISC, should foster, perhaps debate is the wrong word, but should foster a discussion, a dialogue about diversity and inclusivity in global science, with a focus on intersectionality and gender considerations. We believe that specific concerns relate to the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender. I think race is something that is not applicable in every region, but it certainly is applicable in, for example, North America and the US. I think Alice would agree it's a very important issue in Brazil. South Africa, it's very important. And then ethnicity is probably something that features in many of our regions. So actions, as together, we should host a webinar on intersectionality and gender considerations in global science. Perhaps this is something that the SCGES can consider for a future webinar, since you seem to be very good at getting large audiences. And academies very often produce statements on issues which are of importance. So they could produce a statement on intersectionality and gender considerations in global science. Next slide, please. Then there's something that needs to be done on the analysis of discipline-based gender transformation. And this, I think, is something that relates very strongly, perhaps as a follow-up study to the gender gap study that Marie-Francois led, that was concluded a few years ago, and it was the topic of the first webinar that they held. We find that there's a marked variation in gender equality across disciplines. It's not a surprising finding. We all know this. I mean, for example, I drew attention to the fact that academy membership ranges from 7% in the mathematical sciences to 28% in biological sciences. The same thing happens in disciplinary unions. We've got some unions are looking at the numbers of women participating in meetings. Some are looking at women in the STEM pipeline to try and increase the numbers. But there's differences according to the disciplinary union. Some are doing a lot and some are doing relatively little. So there's a real need to work together, I think, as the ISC and the IAP, to try to increase the pool of women researchers in some of the lagging disciplines, so that we can increase the pool of nominations of women who are eligible as academy members. We can't hope to get more academy members in the mathematical sciences if we can't get more women researchers in the mathematical sciences, for example. So there's a lot of work that can be done working together. And I think the underrepresentation of women researchers in certain disciplines represents a convergence point for the IAP and ISC to collaborate on a strategy that can enhance the representation of women. Next one, please. So this recommendation is very dear to my heart, the establishment of M&E frameworks. You will recall that I said that only 6 academies had discussed the recommendations of the 2015 Academy report at a strategic planning session. An extremely disturbing finding. It makes one feel one, invests all this time and effort, money to produce a report for an organization, for a network, and then the member bodies don't even look at the report in any serious way. So I think what this is saying to us is that there's an urgent need for monitoring and evaluation. We believe that it's important to annually collect and report gender disaggregated, I suppose I should say sex disaggregated data. This is not something that's very difficult to do, and it should be annually collected by the unions and by the academies. The surveys that we have just undertaken should be conducted on a regular basis every 5 years, because we need to track the progress. If we don't track the progress, then we don't know what is happening. There's a need for centralized M&E frameworks that requires regular reporting of relevant gender statistics of member organizations. And the ideal place to do this is at the General Assemblies, which are held every 3 to 4 years. And so gender transformation must be tracked at these general assemblies. And then finally, we believe it should be important to assist members to establish their own frameworks. And perhaps just anecdotally, since I think we do have a little bit of time, I can report that of some of the work that we did for the World Academy of Sciences. The World Academy of Sciences is also a member-based academy, but it's of individual members. So members from the developing countries can be elected to membership of TWAS. And as you would expect, TWAS has a fairly low percentage of women. I think the first survey, it was 9%. It's probably now sitting at about 12%. TWAS, to their credit, established a gender advisory committee, which I chaired for many years. I still chair. And we used to look at the statistics of women who were members, women who were incorporated into their committees, women who chaired the committees, women who were invited to make presentations at their annual meetings. And we've been tracking this for many, many years. And we were silently doing this in the background until I think around about 2017, we were really thrilled to be invited to present this during the annual general meeting. So this was the first time that these statistics were brought to the attention of all the members. And I think, that learning has really, I think, helped me in framing some of these recommendations. They need to be reported and all the members need to know about them. So some of the actions here, we believe that a service provider must be commissioned to develop a gender M&E framework for both organizations. They must commit to reporting progress. They must commit to reporting progress at their general assemblies, and they must assist their member organizations to develop their own gender M&E frameworks. And then hopefully we'll have more progress. Next slide, please. So the final recommendation is recommending a shift from a focus on numbers to institutional and knowledge transformation. We have focused a lot on numbers, and I think we're all, those of us who've been in the gender game for some time, are getting a little bit tired of just this continual focus on numbers and lamenting the poor situation. This gender transformation journey of global science organization needs to be about more than just the numbers. Because underpinning why we've got such low numbers is a lot of information. We need to focus, in addition, on institutional culture, because once we focus on that, we're going to improve the numbers, and we need to focus on knowledge production. Importantly, we must ensure that the needs and perspectives of both men and women are considered. It's not just women, it's men and women. They have different needs, different perspectives. So it's a shift from an approach that embraces it's a shift to an approach that embraces the incorporation of a gender lens in everything we do, so that we don't perpetuate a male-dominated approach where women are marginalized and where the global scientific community is deprived of much-needed talent and perspectives. So that brings me to the end of the recommendations. I'll just have one final slide, if we could have that, please. Francois, is there a final slide? I think just a few acknowledgements, and I think on behalf of both Vivi and I, we would really like to say a very big thank you to all the organizations that participated in the surveys, the science academies, the IEC disciplinary unions and associations. We know you've all got survey fatigue, but we're very, very grateful for the valuable information that we received. We would like to thank the organizations that provided funding for this study, the IEP and the ISC, both because they provided secretariat staff and a lot of time and went into these studies, SIDA, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, and of course, the Elsevier Foundation, who really assisted in last year to help us to bring this report to fruition and to publish it and everything. I'd like to thank all the staff who are involved of the three organizations, particularly, excuse me, Peter McGrath and Mathieu Denis Peter of the IAP, Mathieu of the ISC, for their role in executing this project. So thank you very much for your participation. It's a little unsettling not to be able to see all your faces, but as Vivi said, we are going to now have a question and answer session. We finished a little bit earlier than anticipated, so there'll be plenty of time to go in depth into answering some of your questions. And it's over to you, Alice, to sort of draw us to a conclusion and open up the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Roseanne and Vivi, for both your presentations. As you said, we will now look at the question and answers, but as we have time, I would ask Vivi if she wants to make some short comments on the recommendations and what are her highlights of this. Vivi, you have to unmute. You have to unmute.
Oh dear, the unmute button. You know, there's so many issues to pick up on. It's critical that we do take a more systemic and structural view, and we do start fighting really for resources to go into building the structures to help us to move beyond numbers. But we all say that. However, these things only take place if they're dedicated people following up on the policies and making sure that the funding comes in and that the structures take place. And we're all sitting around this virtual table around the world, all people dedicated for that. I don't want to say more about the recommendations, apart from the fact that the ISC is 100% there to work with our partners and allies in taking this forward. I also want to say another thing, that there's no, if we agree, and now I'm going to go at another level altogether, but if we view patriarchy in a way, I was talking to Alice about this before the webinar, as a central organizing principle in society, challenging and overcoming such deeply embedded systems that are profoundly cultural systems as well. I saw a question that came up about, is this a cultural issue as well? It requires constant advocacy, vigilance, and solidarity. A pause in efforts means taking many steps back. So it's absolutely wonderful to see that the young academies present a very different picture. So I'm optimistic from the future, but just one caution from an older woman is that we really have to stick together and continue on this advocacy and vigilance moving forward. I'll leave it now to look at the questions that have come up.
Yes, thank you, Vivi. I think you go to a very, very important point, and I do hope that the consequences of understanding the issues posed by this report will mean, as Roseanne said, that will be a convergence of actions between the two organizations and GenderInSITE to push forward some of the vital recommendations that were suggested. I think that Roseanne very aptly said that some of these are really easy recommendations that could be put into work very easily by academies and unions. And still there's a resistance that one can't understand very well why. So I think that it is very important to look forward to how these three organizations could work together to be sure that some of these recommendations are implemented quickly. I will now suggest...
Alice, I just need to say one more thing.
Yes, please.
That I forgot, is that moving from, we really also need to strengthen our regional, our focus on developing regional networking groups of women in science, looking at gender equity from a regional perspective, and putting resources in building up local and regional groups. It's absolutely critical. There's so many different lived experiences and world views in this. And
Yes,
unless we take that into account, it'll be really difficult to move forward.
Yes, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because this was a very interesting question by our participants, a question by Budi Nurani Hushhana, that exactly asks us to put in regional context all these issues. And he said, would you like to give a suggestion how to increase a women participation at developing countries in academic and non-academic? What I think brings exactly what you're saying. I mean, we also have learned these last 30 years that context is important. And in GenderInSITE, the fact that we had the two regional focal points were really important to understand how different the issues were in different regional contexts. So would Roseanne and yourself perhaps have a few observations relating to this question? Roseanne?
Yes, I think certainly if I could just, re-emphasize the importance of the regional context. And again, Alice, you said that some of these recommendations are really easy to do. For example, the IAP has, I think it's 4 or 5, I can't remember the exact number, regional networks. I know there's one in Africa, the Network of African Science Academies. There's one in the Americas, IANIS, the InterAcademy Network across America, and then there's some Asian ones. These networks bring together all the academies in their region, and they have an opportunity to get funds from the IAP to implement some of their activities, including gender. But what is missing, what's really missing, is an opportunity for these networks to interact in some platform. They each do their work in an isolated way, so they don't learn from each other. And there must be something, for example, that has been done in Latin America that the rest of us can learn from. Because if you look at the academies that are highest ranked in terms of women's membership, they're all sitting in South America. I don't think Brazil falls into that category, but it's certainly Cuba, Venezuela, Chile, and so on. So there's something we need to learn from what they're doing, lessons learned. I mentioned that the Australian Academy is particularly advanced in terms of their gender transformation. So we need an opportunity for them to be able to present, their findings. So regional context is absolutely critical.
May I say something, Alice?
Yes, please, Marie.
Yes, no, it's because I see that there's so many information about people participating to this webinar. So we have people from Uganda, from Egypt, from the US, and there was a list of countries I don't see now, but which was very impressive. Okay, from Kazakhstan, Indonesia, Nigeria, Cameroon, Rwanda, Nepal, as we just heard, Tunisia, Azerbaijan, Brunei, Dar es Salaam, and so on. So just to tell you that, of course, we don't see people who are attending the session on the YouTube channel, but there are really quite a few people there from all parts of the world. And maybe we should also say that, of course, the session is recorded. And then after the webinar, you will be able to watch again the record. Last time, for example, for our first webinar, we had now more than 700 people who've been looking at the record after the session. And also, of course, the slides of the presentation are also going to be available on the SCGES website. So I just wanted to remind this information. And I hope that
thank you very much.
At some point, I would also like to say something about women in mathematics, but I don't know if it's the right moment.
Well, let me just make some comments on what's been done, and I think that you would fit very interestingly in one of the questions that is being asked in the chat. So what I think was very interesting was that there were very clearly questions that not only showed the importance of contextual issues, but also a question whether one of the reasons for gender gap or gender not achieving gender equity would be cultural. And I would then like, perhaps, Marie-Françoise, that you can talk about culture and mathematics, whether there is an influence there that makes mathematics still so less female in its actions. And afterwards, we don't have very much time, but we still have time for Roseanne and Vivi to comment on cultural issues. And one last thing, there is someone from asking whether we know if there are any longitudinal study on the effects and implications on the disparity of gender leadership, male versus female leadership for the many different organizations. For example, the satisfaction findings from those under their leadership. And perhaps Roseanne can answer that. So Marie-Françoise, why don't you start with mathematics?
Thank you. Okay, so what I wanted to say, well, as we've seen, the proportion of women in mathematical, among academicians in scientific academy, the proportion of women is very low, but I must say that it's not reflecting the actual proportion of researchers in mathematics, because the proportion of researchers in mathematics worldwide is a little more than 25%. And we see that when we look, for example, at when we had this gender gap in science project, we looked at the proportion of people authoring mathematical papers. And we've seen that gradually it raised from about 10% in the, like 70 years, say 50 years ago in the 70s, it was about 10%. Now it's over 27%. So there are women in mathematics. And more and more, I would say, of course, not a huge proportion, but much more than in the academies, much more also that in the papers which are published by what we consider as top journals in our discipline. But it's also the case that when some efforts are made, then the proportion gets better. So finally, if we look at the future International Congress of Mathematicians, which was normally going to take place in St. Petersburg, Russia, by the way, and was finally given the war and all this tragedy going on in Ukraine, is now going to become virtual. But in this meeting, the proportion of women lecturers is over 20%. And it was, we have this Committee for Women in Mathematics inside the International Mathematical Union. And there were really, recommendations made to the various committees choosing the lecturers. And finally, we see a change. So this change is not yet reflected in the proportion of women in mathematics in the academies. It's also not reflected in the proportion of women publishing in top journals in mathematics, but it is already, we already see a difference. So, I don't want to give the impression that overall it's only less than 10% women inside mathematics. It's not the case, but it is still the case in some particularly maybe prestigious parts. Okay, so I wanted to say that.
Thank you very much. Perhaps Vivi, you could say, and then Roseanne could comment. Vivi, please.
We already see a difference. So I don't want to give the impression that overall.
I'll tackle it in a different way by saying that the elephant in the room is always gender roles in the family. Looking at our world, historical culture. And I think that in order to address the disproportionate impact of parenthood on the careers of women, for example, the Gender Gap Research Project, points out some very, very neat, good tools that can be put in place to look at, take proper accounting of childbearing and caring responsibilities, in evaluating female candidates and hiring and promotion, to recognize the existence and impact of discontinuous careers for women, to look at hiring and funding policies, to encourage policies to reduce salary disparities. And I think that a whole load of those barriers really do, we just know that, stand in the way of women's active participation and progress all the way to their representation in academies and unions.
Thank you very much, Vivi. Roseanne, would you like to comment? And then Catherine will like to make some comment.
Thanks. So Alice, you mentioned that there was a question from someone looking at asking about longitudinal studies of women and men's leadership. So I can't immediately think of anything that comes to mind. I'm sure there are, but one report that I would refer you to is the report that GenderInSITE published on Pathways to Success, which was a survey of women leaders of global science organizations. So it doesn't give the comparisons between men and women, but it was of women leaders. And I think it was doing what a couple of people have mentioned in the chat, doing more exploration of the underlying reasons for why we're getting the patterns we do. So there's a huge need for these kinds of more in-depth studies that interrogate what are the reasons why there are so few women leaders, and is women's leadership different from men's leadership? And I was just trying to refresh my memory from some of the recommendations of that report, which Alice, I think, knows more about than I do. But I do remember that one of the findings that women have a different type of leadership than men. It's far more collaborative and sort of listening than directed. And also women are very devoted to mentoring. I think anecdotally one can report that women are often the ones who are doing the mentoring of the younger scientists and bringing them up. So I think people, you either get two reactions from women who are in leadership positions. They either have gone through a path where they resonate with the difficulties that women face and they really reach out to help other women. But there are some women who actually make it more difficult and are actually extremely competitive and are not helpful to the younger women at all. But I refer you to that Pathways report. Have a look on our website. It's a very, very interesting report about women's leadership. Thanks.
Thank you, Roseanne. Yes, I remember how interesting it was when we decided to produce that report and how interesting it was. Who were the women leaders? In fact, we did interview one or two men. One of them was Jeff Odom, who was the creator or one of the creators of the Gender Advisory Board of the Commission for Science and Technology for Development. And it's very interesting to see what he says there. There's also a very interesting video interview at the GenderInSITE webpage with Jeff that brings a lot of the issue of leadership and gender. But Catherine, you asked, you wanted to say some words. Please, the floor is.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for these presentations, which I think give us indeed a very good overall picture. But I would like to maybe address the question that was raised. What can we do beyond accumulating data and figures? I should say beyond, because we first need to have this data and figures so that we can actually provide evidence, and we will need to keep it updated, that the gender gap in science is not in our imagination, it exists. And I think that we cannot afford to stop doing the kind of survey you have just done. And going beyond figures is, I think, something that a number of the disciplines that you represent, I'm thinking especially of the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, history, do a lot. And I think at this stage, maybe it would be interesting to get some of the scientists in some of the, for example, in some of the ISC unions to share their findings that are going to be, local. They will often be also based on statistical analysis, but they will be local. And that, I think, is also an important point, because I don't think it is the case that we have a general recipe that is going to work for everywhere in the world. And we do need to learn from the experience of our colleagues around the world to see what works or doesn't work in a given society. So that's one point I would like to emphasize. And as for what Roseanne said about how very, very slowly things make progress, well, I want to quote Isaac Newton when he was asked how he discovered, universal gravity. He said, by thinking about it all the time. And I think that gender inequalities, which are there in science, because they are there everywhere in society, are never going to, lessen. Think about them all the time. And in that, I want to really thank you for the work you have done and presented here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I think you pinpointed something very important, is that gender inequity is one of the oldest and more persistent inequities in society. and there is no way we can solve it without, as you say, thinking about it all the time and making it really day-to-day action. So there is a question from the chat that I think links to these issues. Someone from Colombia, which I'm very glad to have as my sister in the region, Ariadna Garça-Ortiz. So she says some very interesting things, that we are in a transformation process. Today we see sensible women helping others to reach better places. Nevertheless, there are many women at decision-making positions that discriminate. How to help them to understand the change and to improve women conditions. And I think this is a very interesting issue that she raises, because when we think of underlying preconceptions and so on, we are aware that it is not only men who have them, but also among us women, there's still some preconceptions that we have to look at. So will Vivi and Roseanne like to make some comments on that?
Should I start? I think I can empathize with this to some extent. And with a part of it in any event. It took me a very long time before I was comfortable to embrace gender issues and women's committees and things like that. Not that I would ever have done something negative to disadvantage other women, but I kind of came from the viewpoint that, you know what, we need to do it by ourselves. We don't need to have all these special quotas and committees and things to promote gender. I'm not sure exactly what changed my mind, but I now feel very, very comfortable that unless women become activists and take up these challenges, we're not going to see change because you know, people are comfortable, and unless you bring these things to their attention, nothing changes. But I do want to empathize to some extent with people who say they don't want to belong to women's organizations and gender committees and such like. They prefer it to be just men and women. And I think what it does emphasize for me is that it's perhaps only by bringing men and women together to address the issues rather than creating women's only organizations and committees that we're going to really have real change. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good question.
Yes, I mean, a good question for something that on one hand, you know, why shouldn't women take the choice of not focusing specifically on women's only issues? For me, that's okay. My life experience and position is very different, but what we also have to understand as well is that in some instances, there's a little bit of resentment of women having to shoulder the burden of championing gender equality, you know, in their life, particularly in their organizations and in their professional lives. You know, as for many other underrepresented groups, women carry a significant burden in spending time advocating for their right to participate in research on top of their day-to-day professional duties. and this time drains engagement in their professional development opportunities, and therefore subtly favors men in a way. So one of the answers of that is to get male allies, is, as Roseanne has said, to make this, we're talking about gender equity, to work, constantly to work together. So I don't think we need to discriminate against women who make different life decisions, particularly when they're assessing their professional lives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think these last few questions really brought to the table some of the issues that Roseanne brought in some of the recommendations. That is, how to turn all these individual and focused actions into something that is really systemic and structurally changing. So I think this is perhaps the moment that many countries and regions are going through. And I would say that the most of the Western world is in this moment. Although I think there are still many other countries, some of them who are listening to us now, where the struggle is still in a much more initial stage, where bringing women to science is still an issue, and really making them comfortable in science is still an issue. I think that in the Western world, all the Western world now has a majority of women in universities. In many countries, there are a majority in MSc and PhD. So again, what I think the huge question is, okay, they gave us a road and we entered into it with very good results. Why are we not capable then of changing this environment so that we don't have to fight every day, that we are as comfortable here as are the men? And I think this is only achieved if we change the system, the norms, and the culture. And I think this is our major fight from now on, how to change systemically the scientific environment so that women don't have to fight every day for small, very small clashes they have everywhere, and be able really to do their scientific job in an easy and comfortable atmosphere. So, and I think this is a very important moment for many countries at this moment, because I think that one do realize after so many years that the issue of gender equity is recognized in many levels, but how to act upon it is always the issue. So a last comment from Vivi and Roseanne. I think we would have a final round of comments and end this webinar. So Vivi, you're open. Why don't you go?
I think these series of webinars have been excellent. I love the fact that people from all over the world have listened in, and it will get more listenership through YouTube. And I really, I mean, from the ISC's point of view, we've got all our efforts behind this. And I think it's very important that we take every opportunity we can to strengthen our networks and to strengthening our mentorship, particularly of younger women coming up in the scientific world. So thank you.
Rosette, your turn.
So from me, just a very big thank you to everyone who has listened in, and thank you to the organizers in Paris, and of course to Alice for facilitating. I think my parting words are let's stay connected, let's support each other, let's remain energized and let's make a difference so that the next generation doesn't have the same battles that this generation has had. So thank you all for your attendance. It's been a great pleasure to listen to to hear all your questions, and let's hope for something better.
Well, thank you again. I think that with this, we close the second webinar of the Standing Committee for Gender Equity in Science. I cannot but applaud again the wonderful work that is being done by Marie-Françoise and, sorry.
Lucia. Lucia.
Yeah.
Lucia and Colette. Lucia
Yes,
and Colette were very...
and Catherine, right?
Yes.
And they've done a wonderful job of putting this together. I think there will be a lot of many other successful.
Yes. Okay. Maybe we can say something about the two next webinars.
Yes, please do.
Yes. So the next one will take place on the 13th of June. Mm-hmm. And it will be organized by the Union of Psychological Sciences, mm-hmm. with one lecturer in France and the other in India. So it will be, of course, advertised by SCGES. And there will be also another one, which is going to be at the end of June or beginning of July, organized by the International Union of Biological Sciences. So we will have 4 seminars before summer, and then more seminars, of course, after summer. And I wanted to thank also Colette for helping with the chat, and Lucia also, who's organizing the broadcast. And yes, Lucia, we can. I think we can stop now. Is it okay?
Yes, thank you again for everybody. And we're now closing this webinar. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.